Hi, what I'm going to talk about in this particular recording is looking at the project lifecycle. Now I'm going to look at it from a generic point of view to start with, to explain a few things about the sort of phases and the steps we need to go through in projects. Then I'm going to look at the certainly the two key methodologies. The third thing I was going to look at was the ISO 21500, which is the ISO standard for project management. Right. But the first one to look at is this standard view of project lifecycle, and link that to the two current methodologies, PRINCE2 and the DSM AgilePM methods, and look at where the relationship is between them. Right. So we're going to do this in steps and explain a few other things to try and iron out a couple of misnomers like waterfall. Right. This is really an expression that's been used for many, many years. And I'll explain what that is and why people use that method, or at least that description, which is really a very poor way of looking at projects, quite honestly. And I'll explain that as we go through this first cycle. So, the first thing in projects is that we always start off wanting to put some formality behind. There's a few things that kick off from a corporate portfolio program point of view about projects. Mandates, terms of reference. We'll look at all these details in more specific sessions. But at the beginning, there is a trigger for the project. I'll just write that up there just to remind ourselves as the mandate, for example, whatever you want to call it. It triggers the need. And the point about the first phase of the project, whatever you want to title it, is about getting some formality and a high-level view of what the project is all about from a business perspective, and whether that can actually be done from a build perspective, technical perspective, supply, whatever it happens to be. Right. Now, as a point to note, I'm going to use labels. Some labels are specific to the particular methodologies. Right. In the first one, on the traditional view, I'm just going to use a generic label. What is actually important is what is happening underneath that specific label. That is more important, because at the end of the day, you can change the label. As long as everybody working in your project, your organization understands what that label means, then it doesn't matter whether it's preparing, requirements, initiating, planning, it doesn't matter what it happens to be. At that point, you understand what is happening in that particular phase rather than the label itself. It just makes sure everybody's on the same plate. But in the very first instance, what we need to understand is, what does the project require, right? And I use the word here very carefully. This is the project requirement, not to do with requirements what people talk about from products, etc. This is what the project requires itself. What do I need in the project here to run it? And we have some information coming from a mandate, terms of reference, if you like. And what we're going to do now is formalize them for the project itself, put them into specific documents. We'll look at all that in detail a bit later. Right. And of course, if you see in another session, the two main questions that are posed here is why and what. Why are we running? What do we expect to get out of this? Why we run the project, the vision, the rationale, the reasons, and the beneficial change we expect to get out of it. This is the first thing. So we put a formalization so we can make a decision as to whether this is going to work or not. Is it going to be the project we need? Once we've got that in place and we think now it's worth a bigger spend on it, then we can get into the next phase, right, and start to do some more detail. So now we can put some decent design behind the project design, right? This is really where we're going to be doing the how, right? So we're moving to the next phase, the design. And that's when we're going to look at the how of the project. How we're going to run the project. Remember, we talked about these three questions in another session. The how is how we're going to manage it from a project approach point of view, and how we're going to develop the solution. There are a lot of things that need to go on in there, right? And all that's linked to planning, right? Most of this is linked to planning and understanding the scope. And again, we'll look at this in more detail. So they're the first two things. And again, we now need to look at this and see, is it really worth spending a bigger spend on the project, really worth the investment from a business perspective? And between these two, can we understand whether this thing can be built? This is the viability bit. Will it achieve it? Can we build it? Is that a viable solution that we can get through? So a requirement, the business needs to have an understanding of why and what, and the technical people, the people going to supply the solution, Right? Need to understand where they can build it to, that quality, that time frame, the money, the budget they've got in place, and the solution understanding all the risks. All these things come out in it. The design now is putting a lot more detail to have a much clearer understanding about what is it going to take to deliver the solution, what scope can we deliver. And that's very key, so we make a decision at that point whether that's going to happen or not. So we've got, again, step at a time, more detail as we need it. No point trying to plan the whole project before you've even understood what the project is really about, i.e. the requirement of it. Once we've agreed this is going to fly, the next thing now, we develop the solution. So now we go and run the plan and develop the solution. And afterwards we then test and then deliver. Okay, I'm going to put the word here deploy for the moment. Okay, so we build it in development. In the develop part, we test it, always test solutions as we build them in this case, and then we finally deliver it, right? The overall objective gets delivered. So there's a sequence of events, right? Now, yes, I know during the development point, this is where we really run the project at this point through development. And at this point, what we're actually doing here is building the solution. Okay, so there's a lot of monitoring and control. This is where the governance comes in place as much as it does throughout here. There's governance going on in the build bit, the requirements and the design, but as you build it through development, there's governance going on in there as well. Very important. Okay, now, the traditional waterfall view is that this tends to go down. It's like a waterfall from the top to the bottom. So we go through requirements, got that in place, sign it off, go into design, put the whole detail and spec in place, sign that off, develop it all, build the whole solution, test it towards the end, and then hand it over. Of course, fling it over the fence after a period of time could have its problems, because by the time we get to test it, maybe things aren't coming right. And the danger is now we're a problem, we're running out of time and budget for the project. But the point is we get a whole detail here, big design up front as it's called, develop that solution. Now, what it doesn't take in consideration are a lot of things which we're going to look at right now. Right? One other element, which I look at in another session on called the cone of uncertainty, is that we always seem to assume we understand exactly how long it's going to take and cost to build it, or we lock that in. This is really, a very dangerous approach to take, because we don't know how long it's going to take. We have a time frame we need to work in, and therefore we don't understand the real cost, but we can estimate all that reasonably well. We need to have a really good understanding. We'll look at that a bit later. So, the traditional view is we do that now. How about we build a bit, we develop a piece, we test it, and when we test it, we can then deploy that bit, pilot, offline, even straight into operations if you wish, right? Rather than wait until the end of the project and hand the whole thing over, right? Then we do another piece, test that, and then deploy that little piece. And so it goes on, right, throughout the whole project. This is called incremental delivery. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to say, yeah, we do that anyway. Well, of course you probably do. Just here we're just trying to make it a little more evident. Incremental delivery, right? Very important. Now, the reason why it's so useful is because if during development we have a problem on a certain point of it, we can recognize that very quickly at the beginning and fix that up during it. Do we still want it? Does the business still need it? Or can we drop it? Or can we change something? When we get into tests, again, we may have the same situation, but now we can go back and fix that up if necessary. If the requirement is still needed, go back and fix it up. Of course, in deployment, it's even bigger help. If we get a problem, we can come back, either retest it, go back into redevelopment, because maybe now these two parts don't work. Now we deploy them and link them together. And between these two, even more seriously, if the solution doesn't look like it's going to work properly, conceptually, we go back and review the whole rationale behind the project. Right? And it's these feedback loops that actually take this whole idea of the waterfall out of the water, right? Knock it on the head. It's a misnomer that doesn't work. And I'm sure many of us have worked on projects when that hasn't really happened. This is where it really means about waterfall. We cannot go back. Well, this is nonsense. Of course we can. We've always been able to go back if you approach it properly. And that's part of the approach and the development and the project approach. If I've got problems, check them out earlier on. Find out while you're through the project. Because while I'm still in the project, I can fix it up. And towards the end, Hopefully we get towards the end and we're nearly complete. Everything's been signed off. So there are more detailed aspects about this particular approach as well. So bear that in mind, right? No waterfall. We have gating points, monitoring control as we go through, get the business involved. If we've got issues through testing or the build situation, we can sort it out whilst we're still in the project and recognize them through the development and deployment phases of the project. Very simple, right? And that allows us to test us as we go through, keep the business involved and monitor the project's progress. And this is the traditional view of it. As I said, the labels are just there. It's what's happening underneath them that is important. We'll look at these in more detail in another session. What I want to do now is look at the two traditional methods, or the standard methods that are out there at the moment, and show how they're related to this particular view. Because at the end of the day, the life cycle is following a similar pattern. So let's have a look at PRINCE2 first of all. PRINCE2, for those that may be familiar, and if you're not, now you'll see what's happening in PRINCE2. In the requirement phase, stage, process they have in place in PRINCE2, they call it a process, is to have starting up a project. Starting up a project. And as you can see, what's really happening here is the same as you do in a normal project. In the traditional view, what we're looking at is formalizing the information we've got from the project and putting it, documenting down, to make sure we all agree with what's written in the document. This is quite important, by the way. Not just what we've written, we agree what is written, we also agree how to read what is written. This is one of the main really aspects of this requirement, documenting it down formally and make sure we agree and understand what is written in that document. Starting up a project. Right. Once we've done that, we then need to go into initiating a project. So this is the next process that PRINCE2 has, right? Now it also calls it a stage, because now there's quite a bit of work going on in here. So what they also have is something called a stage boundary to mark the end of that particular stage. But it's a process, putting the design, putting the planning together, right? Now, traditionally, Prince puts up here solid foundations, right? Now, how you define solid is quite interesting, really. What it really should be saying is we need to get the planning in place, that we've got an agreement on how this is going to run as we see it now. This is always very key at this point. And any time during the project, really, is how do we see the project at this point in time? Whether it's happened before, where we've got to, and then look at what we need to do next. But in this particular point, it's about solidness. It's about getting a sensible amount of planning in place and understanding about the products you need to build, how we're going to run the project approach, and develop the solution so we can get sign off. Exactly the same as you're doing in the design, really. I mean, these two are doing the same thing. It's just a different label. At the end of the day, it's just a different label. The elements that are going on in there are the practicalities of how we're going to run it and the planning from this point of view, right? Now, the next part here is Prince has these two processes called controlling a stage, because it splits up the activities into stages, increment stages, what's the difference really? And then managing the product delivery, managing the product delivery. And this now takes the plan we've got in here and runs the plan through in a series of increments, stages, again with boundaries at the end of them, each one, to mark the end of that particular piece of work and control the work and build the solution. Now, the interesting thing with Prince really is PRINCE2 is that it looks at the controlling a stage in more detail. Until recently, when they've added the agile aspect of it from a product point of view, the managing the product was left with the team manager and the supplier, whoever it was that was doing the build for you, internal, external, it didn't matter really. So Prince's main focus was on controlling and managing the stage itself and managing the project. Fair enough. Now realize we have to manage products, but we've been doing that anyway. We've only been using this particular guidance and framework to run projects. We've been doing that anyway, right? And then eventually we close the project, we hand the solution over, and we go into a process called closing a project. So as we said, one of the main characteristics is a project has an end, so we need to close the project down. All right? And again, we're just managing the gates through, taking a step at a time, and then however we run this particular area here, it's still developing and testing, whether we want to wait until the very end of the project, deliver it. Bit dangerous, but sometimes you might have to do that. Try and do incremental deployment as you go, or stage deployment, if you like, from a Prince perspective. At the end, we shut the project down. So we formally close the project down and doing whatever we need to, retrospectives, project implementation, reviews, etc. like this. Anything that goes on. But mainly, make sure it's formally closed down. We've had the objectives and they're being signed off. All right? The trouble is, if we say to follow the original waterfall and use that through here, of course, then we have problems. We get to the end of the project, and that's when we start to have difficulties. But you can see, at the end of the day, there's still really only the 5 sections or 4 sections here, starting it up, formalizing it, running the development of the planning of the project, initiating a project, getting all the planning in place, how we're going to manage it, and from a project point of view and the development approach, run that plan through controlling your stage and managing product delivery processes as by stages, increments, and then finally handing the product over. So now you can see the correlation between that one. What I now want to do is look at the DSDM perspective as well. So let's have a look at the DSDM AgilePM one. DSDM, what they call AgilePM. So, DSDM call their first phase, process, whatever you want to call it, their phase is called feasibility. Whoops, feasibility. And what it's doing is the same as starting up and requirements. It's taking the information we come from the terms of reference, right, and looking at whether this thing is feasible or not, right? The overall point here, is it viable, achievable? Right? Viable, achievable, both of them doing the same thing. Taking the information from the mandate, terms of reference, formalising them into the separate sort of documents we need to track how we want to do that. Again, we'll look at those in different sessions. But really a key thing here, understanding the overall project from a business and a technical perspective. Can we think it's going to work? Do we think it's going to deliver what we want it to? At project and high level view only. So it's formalising and agreeing that information. Once we've worked out that that's possibly going to work, hence the no-go decision point here, the gates, we then move into the next phase, and now we put some foundations behind the project itself. Again, what we're doing here is doing the how and the planning of the project, right? What DSDM affectionately says, firm foundations, right? So firm as opposed to solid. Well, again, it's about definition, really. At the end of the day, it's practicalities, it's pragmatic approach. Practicality is about how much information do I need to have for the business to understand. Let's get on with the job, right? We'll see how this thing rolls out as we go along. You know, most of the time we don't, as long as we have clear objectives and understand where the project is going, we don't necessarily always know exactly how we're going to get there. Now, we might have some detailed specs that we got to follow, and that's fine. You know, remember, in another session when I talk about the overall project and how we run it, it isn't a one way of running a project throughout the whole project. It's a series of different approaches and techniques, depending what the project needs at any one point in time, or a phase or stage, whatever you want to call it, within the project itself. This is really quite key. Don't decide I'm going to take this one or that one or some other method I've got in place throughout the whole project. It's about what the project needs as you run it, right? And that might mean running, you know, controlled time frames for specific builds. We'll get what we can out of it when we build it. Some might say, well, I've got to build it to a detailed specification, and it might flex on the time. That is fine, right? There are ways of handling all that, and we'll look at those. But there are ways of handling it. It's just really, it's all up in the head. It's all in the mindset and how you need to run the project, and communicating that and making sure everybody understands why we're going to run it that way, what's the process behind it, and then how we're going to do it. The same 3 questions again, even at this level. So foundations, right? So at that point, we go from feasibility with a gate into foundations, and put some planning, understanding how we're going to run the project, and then we go into the next section, right? Now we go to develop it. This is when it gets a little more interesting, okay? Because now we have, from this perspective, thing called evolutionary development. Right? Evolutionary development, where we're going to evolve the solution in some respects, evolutionary development, we're going to evolve the solution rather than have a detailed spec. Well, at the end of the day, you could do the two the same way. If somebody turns up and says, well, we've got this detailed spec, George, but we need you to build it to that. Say, fine, that's okay, but what we'll do is we'll start off and put us up with a framework together behind it. Like everything else, a little bit at a time, more detail as you go through. Even if you've got the detailed spec, we'll put some part together, like a wireframe around a website, for example, or the framework around a part of the document. How do you like that homepage? What's that framework look like to you? You know, you've got a specific idea, because sometimes the business might turn around and say, well, actually, maybe it wasn't quite what we thought. Here you're giving them an opportunity to put that change in place. This is one of the characteristics we talk about in another session, the change part of a project characteristic, incorporating the change as we go through. And this is what's represented here and up here. If we need to make changes, and we can do that in the PRINCE framework, because at the end of the day, it's doing the same thing. We're building a solution. It's how you approach it from a development point of view, which is really what it needs and what you think you can do. Evolutionary development, right? So we're going to build it a bit at a time. And this is running a specific technique called iterative development. Iterative development, which means build the solution a bit at a time, represented usually like this, a loop. So each loop is building one part of the solution and we add to it as we go along. And that's really what we're represented by here. Now, there's certain techniques you can use. There are product delivery things like Scrum, etc., work in this particular way. And we'll look at that in another session. Right? But evolutionary development, okay, take iterative development, build the solution, even specific requirements a bit at a time. And that's what's going on here anyway. We're building the whole project, a stage, a step, a process at a time. Right? Here we're doing it down at the product itself level, which is absolutely fine. Right? And as we do that, we can also deploy the solution as we go along. So I'll put that up here, deploy parts of it as we go along. So we use a phase called deployment. And as we build, subsets of the solution, put it out there, pilots, test it. We did that once on a number of projects. One specific project was during a new bank teller system for a bank in Australia, where what we needed to do was test the different levels of the applications, each gold, silver and bronze independently on the network, and then brought them together and then test them group-wise on a branch, and then on internally and then externally on a group of branches locally so we could keep an eye on the network, and then we put them out nationally. So everything was piloted a step at a time on different parts and build on the understanding of the network. But we deployed it. But don't always be in a hurry to hand it out to operations. Danger of doing that is, once they've got ownership, taking it back. Because this is still within the project time frame. You're still deploying during project time frame, which gives you the opportunity that if there are problems here, you can go back and fix it. Understanding the impact on the overall deliverable, but we'll look at that later. But iterative development to build the solution slowly, as groups of them get built, we deploy them through increments, stages as you wish. Same principle, which is really what they've used here, product delivery point of view from a PRINCE2 incorporating agile aspects into it, which is predominantly used in Scrum. And that's what we've done here. Taking that iterative approach, that's what Scrum is, it's taking an iterative approach in a particular way, but here we run it slightly differently, right? So understand that, DSCM Agile runs feasibility like starting up, like requirement. It's understanding the high-level view of the project from a quality, a build, and a business perspective, and agreeing the information formally. Once we've got that understanding, now it's worthwhile going and spending a lot more time and building the project here in more detail. This is really great, because now we get a better understanding about estimations on time and costs, what the solution, i.e. the scope is going to look like, and how we're going to build it from a development point of view and run it from a project perspective. Right? Look at all the different aspects of project approach. Right? Once we've got that sign off, and that means developing as much as we think we need, get enough design in place to get on with the job. Because really what you really want to concentrate on is the earlier part of the solution. At that point, you then run the development in whatever shape or form you've designed for those different stages or increments of the project, whatever it is as you go through, time boxes, working packages, whatever it happens to be, then it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you've put that in place and you run it, monitor the project, keep control of it, build the solution, get the business involved in the solution it's built, make the changes that are required to the solution, fix it up. So as you build, you're looking to see where it's going to, first of all, from a business perspective, achieve the beneficial change they want. Is the solution going to work functionally as well? And therefore, that's the agreement, and sign it off as you go through the project. And finally, hand it all over. This is a far more pragmatic way of looking at things, and this is the relationship between them. So it's no this, them or us or that one or that one. It's a complete toolkit to run through the project, the different approaches and the techniques and how you want to manage it. These two are providing you a framework and a guidance to take you through a step at a time and keeping track and keeping control of the project's progress from a solution point of view, but primarily from a business investment and a business beneficial change point of view. No matter what, they're all doing the same thing. So I hope that's clarified a lot about waterfalls, traditional views, and the interlink between these two and the relationship between these two mainstream methodologies.